Good evening, I'm Tashi Yangdun. 2 days before the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics in Beijing, China, we have prepared a special one-hour program on Tibet and the issue of Tibet in relation to China. Media have reported numerous stories on Tibet, particularly starting with the latest uprising in Tibet in March. To learn more about Tibet, Tibetans and the issue of Tibet, Mr. Pema Tsewanla joins us. He sits on the board of the local Tibetan Association of Boston. But first, we'll watch a 35-minute documentary produced by the International Campaign for Tibet, based in Washington, D.C. Titled Devotion and Defiance, Buddhism and the Struggle for Religious Freedom in Tibet. Produced in 2004, this documentary examines the new wave of Communist Party crackdowns on Buddhism in Tibet, and is a companion video to the International Campaign for Tibet's July 2004 report on religious freedom, When the Sky Fell to Earth. Devotion and Defiance depicts the growth of religious institutions in Tibet since the 1980s and the Chinese government's increasing efforts to stop it. This includes rare footages from inside Tibet. We'll be right back with Mr. Pema Tsewanla after this program.
Religion in Tibet, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, is really a center of Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity. And for China to effectively control Tibet, then you really have to destroy that religion, or at least limit it. That is very essential, and the Chinese know this.
Since China's invasion of Tibet in 1949, the Tibetan people have struggled for the right to practice their religion freely. Though the memory of China's violent attacks on Tibetan Buddhism remains, over the last 2 decades, Tibetans have devoted themselves to rebuilding thousands of monasteries, and religious practice has accelerated across the Tibetan plateau. But China's top leaders have expressed deep concern about the continued popularity and rapid growth of Tibetan Buddhism, and a new wave of Communist Party policies to stifle the spread of religion in Tibet leaves the future of Tibetan Buddhism in its homeland uncertain. Today, the Dalai Lama, Tibet's exiled spiritual and temporal leader, remains in India, where he urges for negotiations with the Chinese leadership. And inside Tibet, the struggle for religious freedom continues.
We don't expect that if we shout for religious freedom or human rights in Tibet, that these will be granted straight away. But even if I was beaten, killed, or imprisoned, even if I could only shout a few words, it would help the Tibetan people.
Maybe if our tourists go to Tibet, they will see a monastery, monks chanting, and people are burning their butter lamps, all those things. But this is one level that is these days permit to do that. But Tibetan Buddhism is, I think, it's more than that. It's more than just some kind of a ceremonial thing. You have to study, you have to be trained, and in that level, there's very little freedom to do these kind of things.
You can wear red, but you can't fully practice. We couldn't invite teachers to our nunnery at all. We couldn't even go to receive teachings elsewhere. We would have to ask permission from the local authorities to go for teachings or to invite lamas. There were a few older nuns, and they taught us to recite and memorize manuscripts. But there wasn't a deep religious knowledge like there used to be.
Tibet's monastic tradition began more than 1,200 years ago. The teachings focused on the Buddha's path to enlightenment through mental discipline and compassion for all living beings. The monasteries developed a sophisticated educational system that required a lifelong commitment to contemplation and study. Monks and nuns trained in Buddhist philosophy, debate, and meditation, as well as mathematics, medicine, literature, and the ritual arts. More than 6,000 monasteries would be constructed across the Tibetan Plateau, housing hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns. And as the religious infrastructure grew, so did its political, economic, and social influence on Tibetan society.
This institution becoming so large, and their power and their impact is so large that it's difficult in that society to flourish in other ideas and other sort of parts of civil society.
Buddhism shaped the worldview of the vast majority of Tibetans, whose lives were integrally linked with Tibet's religious institutions. But in 1959, Chinese communist aggression drove the 23-year-old Dalai Lama into exile. And Mao Zedong's government began a massive campaign to shut down Tibet's monasteries. Virtually all of Tibet's monks and nuns were forcefully disrobed and sent back to their villages, sent to labor camps, imprisoned, or killed. The campaign intensified in 1965, when the communist government told Tibetans that their Buddhist beliefs were superstitious and backward, that they must be abandoned in order to modernize Tibet. Mao's Cultural Revolution had begun.
The monasteries were razed through artillery, shells, and people just tearing monasteries apart with their bare hands. And there were a lot of Chinese Red Guards that came up from China to do this. But there were also a lot of Tibetans engaged in it. China was successful in creating this zealous group of people willing to tear down a whole society.
Then there are some Tibetans, they thought this is a good thing. This is their advancing their society and their civilization. This is a march toward the modernization, this march toward communism. When you are so overwhelmed by a huge state like China, with such a huge sort of a political movement, with all the ideology, with the bombardment with the propaganda, and without hearing anything else than what the state is saying, and anybody who's sort of counter to these ideas will be just punished by imprisonment and parade to the street and humiliate you. It's difficult to resist for anybody.
The attacks on Buddhism and the forced abandonment of religious practice devastated the Tibetan people. The Cultural Revolution destroyed all but a handful of the 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. It would take more than a decade and a change of Chinese leadership for Buddhism to resurface from the ruins. In the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping's reform policies allowed for the limited reinstitution of prayer festivals and the reconstruction of monasteries. Though heavily monitored by Communist Party officials, Tibetans took advantage of the chance to once again publicly embrace their culture.
That was really in the Tibetan religion sort of renaissance period. And my generation, maybe even a little older than me or younger than me, maybe I think that time we had a very little idea about Tibetan Buddhism, what it means, what it's teaching. But certainly we identify with our identity.
Perhaps the most impressive example of the resurgence of religious life occurred at Larangar in Kham, eastern Tibet. Under the guidance of a Buddhist monk and accomplished meditator named Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok, Buddhism was undergoing a revival not seen in Tibet since China's occupation. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok avoided persecution during the Cultural Revolution by taking his Buddhist practice into the isolated mountains of Sertar County. In the early 1980s, he began teaching a handful of monks and nuns in a nearby valley. Over the next 2 decades, he attracted increasing numbers of monks and nuns who built their own one-room adobe huts near his residence. The community became known as the Larangar Buddhist Institute. Because it wasn't registered as a monastery, the monks and nuns hoped that they wouldn't be subject to the burdensome regulations that monasteries came under. It was a spontaneous gathering of monks and nuns around a charismatic teacher. Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok trained thousands in Buddhist philosophy and meditation with his rigorous course of study. And Larangar produced hundreds of qualified teachers who have since helped to regenerate genuine Buddhist practice in many other parts of Tibet. Authorities in Beijing didn't anticipate the resurgence of spiritual activity across the Tibetan plateau in the 1980s and 90s. The government provided little support for religious institutions, and communist leaders believed that the Tibetan people's religious faith would diminish with increased economic and social development in Tibet. Instead, Tibetans resisted Chinese occupation with the expression of their Buddhist identity and devotion to the Dalai Lama. Tibetans continued to rebuild and sustain the monasteries with voluntary donations of money and labor.
Certainly, this is the one way to express Tibetans, to say, no, that's not who we are. We have something else, and we identify with the religion, and to saying that we are different from the Chinese, and we feel the difference. And it was quite a proud moment in a lot of Tibetans' life.
This growing expression of religious pride, ethnic identity, and loyalty to the Dalai Lama threatened the Communist Party's vision of national unity. In the mid-90s, authorities in the Tibetan capital Lhasa launched an intensive patriotic education campaign to suppress it. Patriotic education continues in monasteries and lay communities throughout Tibet today. The sessions are often led by Tibetans who have become members of the Chinese Communist Party. In the sessions, they assert that Tibet has always been a part of China, that Tibetans must love the motherland and the Chinese people, and uphold the leadership of the Communist Party.
Some Tibetans fully believe what they're saying because they've been brainwashed by the Chinese. But I believe most Tibetans do it because their livelihoods depend on it.
Tibetans are required to study and often memorize Marxist doctrine, and they are forced to denounce the Dalai Lama, whom China characterizes as a threat to the unity of the motherland and an obstacle to the proper development of Tibet.
When meetings were held, anybody over the age of 18 had to go. And if they said that whole families had to attend, then we had to. We couldn't say we had other work to do.
야나 정권주 미마스 형기 아니 대비 달체제 지로네 배배 병행이 주발이야 아 토담체고 와르스 나 단다 카테 중로바 용시에 이거는 별 랑자인 세 개저게 드라마를 시에요 봐 자와야 차네 주소 대자 야우시라야 내주도 용시 말에 얘네 뭐 중앙 거서야 시라 개점 뒤에도 가는 무슨 저야 나도야 봐지 주소 화야 토담들이야 지부슈야.
In the monasteries, the sessions are designed to identify, expel, or arrest dissident monks and nuns whose Buddhist beliefs or political views conflict with Communist Party principles. The classes can last from 5 days to 3 months. At the end, monks and nuns are forced to sign a document declaring their opposition to the Dalai Lama and professing loyalty to the Communist Party. A refusal to sign can lead to expulsion from the monastery or imprisonment.
Whenever they called us, we had to go no matter what. We didn't have the right to say no. Sometimes they would call us to class during prayer sessions, and we had to go.
They
would say His Holiness the Dalai Lama was a splitist. They would make us call him bad names and denounce him. That's impossible for us. We'd rather be expelled from the nunnery than denounce the Dalai Lama.
They know that what Tibetan people really feel about Dalai Lama. They believe that if you can just repeat lies for 1,000 times, and some people will be fooled by it. And they believe in their propaganda because that's the only way they know how to address the issues.
So monasteries were seen as hotbeds of dissident activity and pro-independent sentiment, which in large part was true. Monasteries in some ways are like universities that way. You get a lot of young monks or nuns together, and they're going to talk amongst themselves and take action.
China learned that lesson in the late 80s and early 90s, when the Dalai Lama appealed to the international community to help negotiate a political compromise. Genuine autonomy for Tibetans within China. Beijing's rejection of the Dalai Lama's proposal and criticism of him in the Chinese press sparked a revitalized movement for Tibetan independence in the monasteries of central Tibet. Demonstrations erupted in Lhasa. Brutal reprisals from Chinese military killed scores in Lhasa streets. More than 1,000 monks and nuns were imprisoned and tortured. More than half of Tibet's political prisoners are monks and nuns, some with sentences as long as 18 years. Ani Choying Kunsang spent 4 years in Drapji prison for demonstrating in Lhasa's main bazaar in 1995. She shouted for religious freedom, human rights, and independence. She was charged with endangering state security. When Ani Choying expressed her religious or political beliefs in prison, she was stripped naked, beaten by groups of male guards, and shocked with an electric cattle prod.
They'd use electric batons on our mouths, on our heads, and on the palms of our hands, and beat us with long black rubber pipes. They hit me many times. I had gashes on my head, and my nose bled. I received many punishments like these.
According to the U.S. State Department's annual human rights reports, the torture and abuse of detained monks and nuns occurs routinely in Tibet. In addition to severe beatings, common forms of torture include exposure to extreme heat and cold, hanging by extremities, deprivation of sleep, and electric shock to the genitals.
Even if we are killed after shouting a few words, I still think that it's worth it. If we remained silent, didn't protest in any way, and only listened to the Chinese, then what little religion we can practice in Tibet would disappear altogether.
Increasingly, a lot of the communist cadres realize that this official doctrine of religion withering away isn't really part of human nature and human society. So I think there is a growing realization that religion is here to stay, and China sees it more of a job of just how they manage it so that it doesn't become a threat, it doesn't become a source of power for people to start living and thinking independently.
To monitor compliance with party guidelines, China closely regulates the activities of Tibet's prominent religious figures. The most influential are those believed to be reincarnations of eminent Buddhist teachers from the past. Tibetans regard such reincarnations as holy beings, and while the Dalai Lama is the best-known example of a recognized reincarnation, there are hundreds of others across Tibet.
I think the goal certainly is to try to make sure that the reincarnations that are brought up in Tibet are more obedient to China. They become the leaders in Tibetan society. I think China realizes that they can't get rid of them, so they're going to co-opt them.
In 1992, at the age of 7, Ugyen Tinley Dorje was enthroned as the 17th Karmapa, one of the most important reincarnated figures in Tibetan Buddhism. Communist officials attended the enthronement, where they publicly announced their claim to the historical and legal right to appoint what they called living Buddhas in Tibet. Authorities hoped to mold the Karmapa into a patriotic monk and use him as a mouthpiece for the Communist Party.
They just had huge, media sort of spinning around him from the beginning, when the Karmapa was recognized by Chinese government and, took him to Beijing and meeting with Jiang Zemin, and 8 or 9 years old Karmapa was praising the economic development in Tibet. At the time, they thought that this could work, by developing economic. They're grooming those Lama, and then we don't have to worry about the Dalai Lama, and then Tibetans will be happy.
The Karmapa spent his youth under the strict management of local officials, without access to the teachings and training he needed as the emerging spiritual head of an ancient Buddhist lineage. But he refused to compromise his religious education for the party. And like tens of thousands of monks and nuns before him, who fled over the Himalayas to seek a better education in the Tibetan exile monasteries of India, so too did the 14-year-old Karmapa in 1999.
It was a very daring escape, which was really embarrassing for China. And it's a great loss, I think, for Tibetans not to have him there in Tibet. Even though now he's able to get a real education and a proper education that he, as a Karmapa, should. I think it's really unfortunate that China couldn't have allowed him a little more breathing room and that he couldn't have remained.
Even more influential in Tibetan society is the Panchen Lama, another reincarnation that China has sought to bring under its control. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Panchen Lama shares a unique relationship with the Dalai Lama, in which the elder of the two is responsible for identifying and mentoring the younger. The previous Panchen Lama, Choki Gyaltsen, advocated for religious freedom throughout his life and spent more than a decade in prison for his criticism of Chinese policies in Tibet. After his release, he again devoted himself to restoring Tibetan identity and religious freedom until he died mysteriously in 1989 at the age of 50, just as his open condemnation of Chinese policies intensified. Despite Beijing's efforts to control the search for the Panchen Lama's reincarnation, over the next few years, Tibetans would smuggle information and photographs of the candidates to India for the Dalai Lama's consideration. And in May of 1995, the Dalai Lama identified the 11th Panchen Lama. His name was Gendon Choki Nyima. He came from a remote part of central Tibet called Nagchu, and he was 6 years old.
China waited a few days to figure out what their response was going to be, and then decided that this little boy should disappear.
Gendon Choki Nyima and his parents were abducted and taken to Beijing. They have been held incommunicado ever since. Authorities stated that the selection of the Panchen Lama was an internal matter, and that the Dalai Lama had no right to determine reincarnations. 6 months later, they staged a highly publicized lottery to choose their own Panchen Lama from a group of Communist Party-approved candidates. Their selection, Gyaltsen Norbu, was enthroned in front of Tibet's most sacred shrine in December of 1995.
Chinese communist, who doesn't believe any afterlife or any sort of religion in any sense. It's ridiculous. I know inside Tibet, these are painful, just interfering in a lot of people's belief system, a lot of people's whole cultural system. And, as much as many Tibetans in some ways are hostile to that, the boy appointed by the Chinese government, I think there's nothing to be blamed on this little child, which has been a tragedy in this political mess.
While authorities continue to groom Gyaltsen Norbu to be a patriotic Lama, Gendon Choki Nyima, now a teenager, remains under house arrest. Since the Panchen Lama dispute, monasteries are often required to display government-distributed photographs of the Chinese-chosen Panchen Lama, and images of both Gendon Choki Nyima and the Dalai Lama are officially banned in Tibet.
Used to be in the late 80s that you would see photos of the Dalai Lama in the market, and by the mid-90s, the photos were nowhere to be seen, and they were nowhere to be seen inside monasteries. But if you knew where to look, you could find Tibetans just about always had photos of the Dalai Lama behind some other photo. And so it was always covered up, but they were still there.
While some Tibetans softly resisted state control of their religion by concealing photographs of the Dalai Lama from authorities, others resisted more openly. In 1998, Tibetans held a massive prayer ceremony for the Dalai Lama's long life near the town of Kanze in Kham, eastern Tibet. A local monk and scholar named Geshe Sonam Phuntsok organized the prayers. Tibetans in Kanze revered Geshe Sonam Phuntsok for his help with the reconstruction of several monasteries and the development of social welfare projects in the Kanze area. Over the years, he also taught Tibetan language to thousands of young monks, nuns, and children of nomads.
He attracted more attention from the authorities because they realized that this man was someone who had a lot of clout, and even though he wasn't political, neither was he totally under their control. And after these long life prayers, he was the target of the wrath of the party.
In October of 1999, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok was arrested for leading the prayers. Charged with engaging in activities to separate the motherland, he denied having ever advocated for Tibetan independence. His arrest sparked massive protest, resulting in a heightened military presence and increased surveillance in Kanze. At his trial, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok admitted to having organized prayers for the Dalai Lama, but argued that such activities do not harm the national unity of the People's Republic of China. He was sentenced to 5 years in Nakba prison. Despite the crackdowns in Kanze in the late 90s, in neighboring Sertar County, the Larangar Buddhist Institute continued to grow. By 2001, more than 8,000 students resided at Larangar, which had become the cultural nexus of the surrounding lay communities. Larangar not only attracted Tibetans, but also drew more than 1,000 Chinese.
There are more and more Chinese people who have greater interest in religion in general, spiritual life in general, but in Buddhism and in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. And you can see that more and more people go to Tibet and want to learn more about why Tibetan people are so devoted into their religion and what's there for them.
Now there's an extra layer of implications that Tibetan Buddhism may going to have an impact in the Chinese society, and in that case, what does it mean to the state?
Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's increasing popularity among Chinese Buddhists and the sheer number of monks and nuns at Larangar alarmed Beijing.
If people devote in the religion and have a large gathering, they're afraid they'll turn into some political rebellion. They're fundamentally insecure of the land and the people who they occupy, and they want control.
Despite the fact that the Institute had no history of political activism and carefully followed party guidelines with respect to the Dalai Lama, Larangar became the target of a campaign to decrease the number of monks and nuns permitted in monasteries. Monasteries no longer had to be politically active to come under attack. They just had to grow large enough to worry authorities. Officials ordered Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok to reduce the number of monks and nuns by sending them home. Unwilling to do so, he appealed to authorities to protect their freedom of religion in accordance with China's constitution.
The Chinese constitution has quite a lofty words, from freedom of expression, freedom of association, to freedom of religion. Yeah. But there is also a guiding line above that, which is the Chinese Communist Party is the leading party of this country. In other words, that's it. Whatever rest of say on paper, it doesn't really mean much, if anything, threatening the fundamental interest of Chinese Communist Party.
Work teams backed by army personnel arrived in June of 2001 to implement the expulsion of over 6,000 monks and nuns, including all Chinese. Officials paid hundreds of migrant workers 250 yuan, about $32 for each dwelling they destroyed. With the demolition of over 3,000 residential quarters, authorities prevented monks and nuns from returning.
That was a really bad indication how far they are willing to go if they need to. Without international concern, I think China will have a free hand to do whatever they want to.
Chinese people has the responsibility not only for a democratic government itself, but also to make sure the Tibetans and every ethnic groups the Chinese living with together, no matter what kind of political solution will come out, that they can live with, they are happy with, and their fundamental freedom and rights are being respected. And that is a long road.
I have great hope that China is really in the midst of a transition, and China will change. I believe so. I think they will see the value of Tibetan Buddhism as part of a diverse culture. It's not going to be a threat to the state if they be open-minded. But I think before we reach to that stage, I think Tibetans have to struggle inside Tibet, and outside the international community need to make sure that their voices be heard.
To learn more about the issue of Tibet, Mr. Pema Tsongla, Can you give us a brief picture of the status of Tibet as a nation before the Communist Party in China came to power? I believe the People's Republic of China established on October 1st, 1949.
Thank you very much for having me here. Going back to your question, yes, the People's Republic of China was formed on 1st of October 1949. Now, whereas the status of the Tibetan nation was concerned, I would like to give you a brief overview of what Tibetan nation was before the Chinese invasion. In order to actually Tibet, widely known as the snowland, or a land surrounded by snow mountains, is from every respect a complete independent sovereign nation since 127 BC, when the first king of Tibet, Nyatitsempo, was enthroned. From then to the present, Tibet has its own history of 2,135 years, during which time it remained mostly sovereign and independent nation. Now, whereas the Tibetan history itself is concerned, as I said earlier, from 127 BC up until the present, there was a unbroken lineage of rulers. Right. From the first king, Nyatitsempo, up until the 6th century, there were several kings who ruled Tibet. But during that time, not as a whole area of Tibet, what we call Tibet right now, including all 3 provinces. And those were the times when these history of Tibet were recorded orally, not in the written form. But then, since the 7th century, when King Songtsen Gampo sent his minister Thimisamboda to India, and then when he returned back and he invented the Tibetan script, and from then onwards, up until the mid-9th century, the Tibetan Empire emerged as a very powerful and very strong militarily in Asia. And there were certain times when Tibet conquered China and certain parts of India as well. And it was also during the 7th century that Buddhism was introduced into Tibet.
Right.
And then it flourished. So in that manner, it was ruled by different kings of Tibetan origin. And then later on, especially during the 9th century, when King Langtharma was assassinated, and then even though at that time Tibet was, although emerging as a very strong and powerful country, but since the king was assassinated, then the Tibetan Empire disintegrated. into several small areas in which there were several, sometimes tribal kings, sometimes tribal chieftains, and then it went on like that for about nearly 3 centuries. And then later on, in the 13th century, when Dongkun Chökye Pakpa, a lineage of the Sakya tradition, came into power, so he restored the full sovereignty of Tibet, and he ruled over the whole area of Tibet, what now we call 3 provinces of Tibet, Kham, Amdo, and Uzang.
Okay.
And after Sakya came Digung, and then Rinpoche, and then Tsangpa, and then the Dalai Lama lineages. So if you go through all these history of Tibet, yes, of course, like other nations, there are sometimes ups and downs. Other than that, Tibet was ruled by a Tibetan for all those many years, up until 1950, when the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet. So geographically, historically, culturally, and linguistically, and socially as well, speaking, Tibet was an independent and sovereign nation up until the Chinese occupation in the name of liberation in 1950. And even whereas the ethnicity of the Tibetans are concerned, the Tibetan feature resembles a mixture of Aryans and Mongolians, not the Chinese. And then whereas the language is concerned, Tibetan language is composed of 4 vowels and 3 consonants, unlike the Chinese.
Characters, okay.
And even if you think geographically, Tibet was located in a plateau, what is normally widely known as the roof of the world,
Right.
is surrounded by mountain ranges, including the Himalayas, from all the directions. And that is a geographical demarcation. And secondly, we all know the Great Wall of China. So these physical demarcations also speak for themselves that Tibet was an independent nation.
Thank you, sir. So you mentioned 1950. We often hear the dates 1950 and 1959. What is the significance of those 2 dates in relation to Tibet and China?
Well, the significance of 1950 and 59 is that 1950 was the year when People's Republic of China, in the name of liberation, started invading Tibet from the eastern part of Tibet. So they started coming into Tibet.
Right.
And that was when the People's Liberation Army came to the eastern part of Tibet, and they started coming into Tibet in the name of liberation, so that they can occupy Tibet. And whereas the 1959 is concerned, it was the year when the Tibetan people rose up against the Chinese rule, as well as it was also the year when His Holiness the Dalai Lama who is the temporal as well as the spiritual leader of Tibetans, fled Tibet and sought refuge in India because of the fact that the Chinese communists failed to honor or implement the provisions that are outlined in the so-called 17-point agreement which was made between Tibet and China. So I think that was the significance of it, and so therefore we always commemorate
Right.
10th March every year.
Okay. In recent news, we hear the Chinese government's continues blaming and accusing the Dalai Lama of splitting their motherland. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, when someone gets too desperate or out of desperation, people do very strange things and people say very strange things. And the Chinese government is not an exception. Because from my belief, the Chinese government is very much afraid of the popularity of His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the one hand,
Okay.
and on the other hand, they are doing this in order to save their own face. Because what is happening inside China and, of course, in Tibet and in Mongolia and in Xinjiang, the whole world knows. So therefore, they are using this kind of abuse or venomous remark just in order to blame the whole thing on His Holiness the Dalai Lama. My own thought on this is that it is very ridiculous because of the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama at present do not seek Tibet's separation from China. He is rather willing to forego the Tibetan independence and stay with China, stay with the mainland through his middle way approach, and he only seeks a meaningful autonomy for the Tibetans within the framework of the Chinese constitution. So therefore, I think rather than His Holiness the Dalai Lama being a splittist or separatist, he is making a huge contribution towards the realization of Hu Jintao's policy of harmonious society, peaceful rising. If these are not rhetoric, if Hu Jintao really wants a harmonious society and a peaceful China, then the Chinese government should welcome the overture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama is rather contributing towards the Chinese national integrity rather than splitting Tibet from China.
Okay.
So therefore, these kind of accusations are I think, is quite ridiculous, and as well as it's just to save their face.
So I was just wondering, were you born in Tibet? Can you share a glimpse from Tibet, during your childhood?
Yes, I was born in Tibet, but unfortunately, I have a very vague recollection of Tibet because of the fact that at that time I was only about 6 or 7 years old when we escaped from Tibet to Nepal. But what I clearly remember is the landscape of my birthplace, which is really very fascinating, enchanting. Wherever you look, you will see meadows and pastures dotted with beautiful flowers, wild flowers, and also there would be crystal clear lakes and small streams, herds of yaks and flock of sheep grazing on those pastures, and especially during the night, the sky would be very clear, and I remember having enjoyed seeing the bright stars in that very clear blue sky. And I also remember seeing people going to the monasteries, as well as people singing, dancing during the festive occasions. And then, of course, I also remember the arduous journey that we made from Tibet to Nepal.
Okay. Can you give us a sense of Tibetans in Tibet, like how many there are, and what sort of rights do they have and don't they have in the current days?
Well, the 6 million Tibetans have suffered for the last more than 50 years under the Chinese repressive rule. And they are still suffering. And whereas the rights that the Tibetans inside Tibet enjoy is concerned, I think the only rights that the Tibetans in Tibet enjoy is to obey the dictates of the Communist Party of China and to have their loyalty towards that party. Other than that, leave aside the political, social, and economic rights. The Tibetans inside Tibet are deprived of every fundamental human right. So therefore, they are going in such a situation, especially during the last 4 or 5 years, and then most recently, the repression and oppression and the suffering that the people inside Tibet are going through is unimaginable.
We know that the local Tibetans gather in Harvard Square weekly to highlight the situation in Tibet. Can you give us a sense of what the local Tibetan community feels towards the Olympics in Beijing, and what are the future aspirations in the short term, please?
I think the main reason why the local Tibetans gather in Harvard Square is because of the fact that, first of all, they want to highlight the prevailing situation inside Tibet and to garner support for the Tibetan cause from the from our American brothers and sisters,
Okay.
and then at the same time to appeal and to request the American public and the government to support the cause of Tibet so that His Holiness the Dalai Lama would be able to return to Tibet, as well as the Tibetans inside Tibet will have the complete freedom of their religion, freedom of expression, and freedom to preserve, promote their culture.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you all for watching Somerville Cable Access Television. Good night.